Poem is called Strike. What's the mood of the general strike? I think something changes in the air. Particles rearrange themselves to spell enough kidnapping in the dead of night, murder, endless poverty stretching for miles and miles. If you observe the mood, you might be able to hear your heartbeat in your tooth and then your toenail, then the very tips of your fingers. The mood of the general strike is not in the body of man. It's burrowed deep in the earth. It begins to shake every time the past defeats itself and the clock simmers. The mood of the general strike might only be defined by what it is not. If I had to approximate, I can only say something like, imagine you are a free diver and you break the surface when you're expecting to drown. Imagine that breath, the sheer scope of it, the relief that floods through you. In Haiti and Sudan, it's hot sun and barricading the streets. For Amazon workers in America, it's union meetings in nondescript buildings. For the enslaved, it was choosing your own death, sabotaging commodity. The general strike happens when North meets South. It's when newness runs its finger over the impasse that is the contemporary. The general strike is a point of departure. It's a strike out, a refusal to play the game. It's a strike, the act of marking one's target. It's a strike, an act of violent insurrection. It's a strike, a correction of the old mistake. It's a strike, hard to read and even harder to describe. The mood of the general strike is solemn. It's the moment you realize that you have to do something with the life you have taken back. The mood of the general strike is the parceling out of the boss's bones to pick our teeth with. The mood of the general strike is either you are with us or you will be crushed, no nuance. The mood of the general strike is scorched earth and nobody narrating it as it happens. The mood of the general strike is when the text becomes discernible, just for a moment. The general strike is staring at what was once obscured until you can make out its edges, like we're doing now. It's recognition despite restriction, a recognition of yourself for what you are, a worker. The general strike says, instead of working for the man, let's work for love. Let's work for each other. Let's work so nobody has to work again. Let's work for song and for dance. Let's work in service of pleasure. Let's work and work and work so finally we can talk about something other than work. What's the color of the general strike? Well, to know that, you have to know the color of the future. That's easy. A mix of every color currently imaginable. But mostly that color that is the absence of light. You know the one. Thank you. So this short story is called She Kept Making Yesterday Tomorrow, and it's broadly about kind of like time travel. Sorry if it's a bit hard to keep up with. She kept making yesterday tomorrow. There she was about to teach a class that she knew had taken place yesterday. It might easily have been dismissed as déjà vu, if not for the speed at which she anticipated her students' responses. Brianne would have an answer prepared, Anna would say something spontaneous but never loud enough, and Dee would arrive late in 3, 2, the door of the lecture hall swings open. Dee is out of breath, head down, scrambling for a seat. From the lectern, Fanta was preparing to tell them that nation-states were a fiction. Such fictive entities made real the categories necessary to sustain themselves. Citizen, non-citizen, insider, outsider, human, alien. In the same way a circle completes itself. They ordered and sorted populations and then marked those set for expulsion. It was this cruel trick that underpinned the business of global governance. This was the work of capital, to turn the deaths of refugees into something innocuous in order to propagate a simple lie. There is not enough to go around. If the citizen enmeshed in scarcity logic knows one thing, it is that anything your neighbor owns, he owns at your expense. She felt the gasps at the next slide before she pressed the pointer. It presented an ongoing count of the people who had drowned in the Mediterranean in the last year. Next, she played clips of news reporters following the boats-like game in open season, watching as they capsize, only to return to their own families and dinner tables come 7 p.m. It was grotesque, but she used this part of the lecture to shake the students out of their lethargy. It was not enough to stand up there and say someone is drowning, someone is dead, and the nation to which you belong facilitates it. You had to make them see the pain in ways that would haunt them. A blink. Then she stood between what had happened and what was destined to happen, between the real and the possible. She knew philosophers had fought over the real possible distinction for decades, and there she was, teetering on the edge of it against her will. Fanta felt a strange temporal lag. Suddenly words gained weight. Her mind slowed down enough to see muscles twist themselves into facial expressions, to see the cognitive motivations of her students become the driving force behind their speech and actions. To be clear, she had gone from what she thought was the present to the day before yesterday's tomorrow, poised to teach a class she knew she had already taught. Fanta's eyes filmed over. The words she would say floated just above her head, close enough to touch. When she landed back in her body, the temporal burst winded her. Fatigue and disorientation set in. She was not adventurous and decided to leave what she did not understand alone. But with all things given to a person without reason, curiosity grabbed the scruff of her neck and refused to let go. The possibilities of the classroom had begun to wilt. Nobody had told her that the academy was a graveyard where collective resistance went to die. It was not that she stopped believing in pedagogical promise, just that it shifted nothing in a world geared towards the market. The university was a dead building with dead principles. She, placed precariously, wished to be ejected from it as soon as possible. The classroom was not refuge. It was not even a place to explore the relationship between thought and action anymore. It was just another layer of the metric, or an exercise in surveillance. Fanta was the only black faculty member, and so they asked her to chair the discussion with Simon Alden, a senior professor in cultural studies at UFF. Perhaps the most progressive academic left in the department, he always wore clashing prints and ill-fitting suits. His clothes never rested on his body in the right way. He took everything too seriously, and this made him intimidating. It's a damning indictment of the left's failure to hold ground, he began, like they always did. He liked to deliver this particular sermon from above so that it landed onto the unsuspecting ears of his listeners. They were too in love with what they imagined theory could offer. Meeting them at the door of chaos and spontaneity, he slammed it shut, told them to get real. The autonomous zone would never survive. Everything was being sacrificed at the altar of identity these days. You couldn't even walk down the street anymore without a 20-something with AirPods telling you to shut up. He missed the 80s. Back then, the smell of revolution hung in the air. Potentiality chased you around campus. You could have sex without worrying what the woman was thinking or feeling. They came close to dying so many times, and what a way to remind them what life was for. Learning was communal. In the 80s, they huddled around a common struggle the way one does at campfire, wanting, above all, to find the ties that bound them to one another. Something about that connectivity had been lost. Newer generations had been raised on the myth of the individual and iPhones, a tragedy. Fanta felt sorry for him. They laughed as he bumbled in with shoelaces untied. There was a picture of him and Damasi Hassan floating around the internet somewhere. People shared it on Twitter. Where was that Simon? Now he was all reaction and technophobia, while 16-year-olds shared illegal PDFs of his books online. She wanted to scream, libraries don't exist anymore. That's not their fault. After the lecture hall incident, it only happened in the halls of the archive library. She started taking the material home when new realms opened up. When you tell the university that you were doing research, they mostly leave you alone to come up with whatever concept will win you the next award or secure your next book deal with a star-studded press. And so she was left alone with the material in order to have an experience. Of particular interest were Black revolutionary movements and how the archive might help her redefine ideas of struggle, of emancipation and political discipline. The temporal leap was only possible when Fanta took seriously that archival objects could tell us something about ourselves. It came from a place deep inside, a desire to know what had passed. The photograph, the poster, the pamphlet were all evidence of struggle, yes, but they also contained a trance-inducing ability to reconfigure liberatory desires. The object had a relationship to political integrity. It can make us take seriously the promises left in the whispers of what survived the past. It felt akin to being sliced right down the middle. A smooth dissolving of the material that made up the body. Skin and bones sucked themselves into knots. Her body became a wave, a polyphonic reverberation. Fanta was touching what they called history. There was nothing prefigurative about the events she witnessed. She moved 2 degrees to the right and saw revolt. To her left, the inner workings of the commune were laid bare. She saw the dishonored labor that made the Industrial Revolution possible. She tried to stop 1492 to no avail. Fanta had always known something wasn't quite right with history. They created narrative totality out of the stuff of nightmares. History haunted her classrooms, hollowed out the knowledge she wished to share with her students. What the archivists had told us were history's wins and losses really amounted to a series of processes and events to which she became privy. It felt divine, though the anarchist in her would not allow it to be. Unsurprisingly, it did not go how they said it would go. For example, they wrote about rebellion and uprisings, but not the human excrement the women cleaned from the streets in the coming days. Nobody wrote about who dealt with the mess, the piss, the shit, the bricks of history, or who rebuilt entire towns and cities, how they went about ordering human life when the state crumbled briefly in the short years spanning 1890-something and 1900. She looked up. Granules scattered in the air rearranged themselves to spell out, "You are entering unknown territory." Ignoring the warning, Fanta watched as the words dissipated at her feet. She always made it back these days, having full control over the temporal warp. The first time had been so unexpected that the experience had sent her spiraling. She tried to explain it to Tej, who looked at her with concern and worried about how much she was sleeping. Fanta was determined to bring her in. What was the point of touching temporality, of remembering its shape and smell, if not for how it might be rendered to others? Traversing the pockets of historical events alone had taught her, even as the unimaginable occurred, that events were made real only in the presence of others. In Tej, she found the most precious alliance. She was determined to arrange these little pieces of yesterday for Tej's pleasure and inspection. Tej had to overcome her attachment to rationality first. Fanta helped by speaking about embodied knowledge over breakfast and how love could propel them into the terrain of the impossible in bed at night. After all, there were so many forces, structural and otherwise, that reminded them of the unfeasibility of their lives together. And yet here they were, living. Fanta's playful incursions took away the misery of wage labour. Who could see her here, tucked in the corner of 1791, watching the executions of slave masters with glee? She realised that pictures were a satisfying portal. Soon, the archive became a way to deal with the confinement that seemed inherent to the present. A bad day at work ended with her back on the steps of the Winter Palace during the October Revolution. An argument with Tej ended in the heyday of 80s New York. It was as she expected, drugs, and more drugs. Fanta realised the power of her own touch. There was no space between the object and her fingertips. The permanence of the thing fell away, and with it, her distance from the material. She became involved in the scenes. Soon it was hard to know where each one started, and she stopped. Each time she came back bewildered. Who wouldn't be? One second you were in the library or in your makeshift study, and the next you were witness to people storming the citadel. She would meet panicked eyes with panicked eyes. There was no time to explain, only pick up a weapon and storm with them or die. There are no spectators in a moment that may or may not become history. This she learned quickly. If the bank was on fire, or the prison, or the state building, there was nothing to be done but become part of the mass, to feel the mass breathe, to respond to its needs, to bring the skills she'd learned on Google to the front line. It occurred to her that she should move tentatively, so as not to upset the edges of the temporal landscape and irrevocably change the present, like they did in films. Fanta never allowed her heels to touch the ground, so that, returning from yesterday, she met tomorrow unchanged. There was still the obligation she was running from, still things that she was hesitant to tell Tej. The escape enabled her to go about her days with new vigor, to love, to fuck, to be a good worker, all without alerting anyone to her travels. It was amazing how little people noticed about others. She would be gone for hours, slipping into the minutes of a quick trip to the bathroom or a run to the corner shop for toilet paper. At lunch with Damasi Hassan, she brought up Simon. It was 1975 and Damasi was overworked, squatting with black radicals in Berlin. Fanta longed to know history's gossip. The archive couldn't tell you who loved and who was left heartbroken, who became comrades on the off chance, who found each other out of necessity. All the little details were erased in the construction of history. She wanted to gather what she could to selfishly inform her own research. What had Damasi and Simon's relationship consisted of? Why had she left all of her papers to him? Where was his ability to conceive of that tomorrow that they had dreamt up together and left in the party's papers? Damasi's acceptance of Fanta's presence, without so much of a whiff of suspicion, was what convinced her that the past, present, and future are contemporaneous. Fanta told Damacy that she was from the future, expecting to be accused of being an undercover police officer. All Damacy did was pull a cigarette from the pocket of sleek black trousers, offer it to Fanta, and then invite her in. The house had many levels, each dedicated to keeping the machine running. There was a food rota and household labor was shared amongst all members. That was the price of admission. The lawyers worked on their justifications for remaining in the building and keeping the police at bay. At weekly meetings, they decided strategy, organized the various political education projects and the free breakfast programs for local communities. They painted the walls and decorated the room with leather couches, wooden tables, and bureaus found discarded on the street. They were working on getting every person a bed. Architects from the Women's Centre had turned one of the floors into a printing press and built a nursery in case a nursery was ever needed. The reading groups were heated spaces, but theory was never disconnected from the practical needs of the day. So we're still alive in the future. Will we be successful? Most importantly, did we create a foundation solid enough for people to build on? These were her first questions. Before Fanta could answer, it struck her that Damacy lived her life believing that better days were to come. She lived for a world in which food, shelter, love, and care did not have to be earned. She was adamant that we could just take what we needed, reach a hand out together and see what happened. That clear-eyed determination was somehow missing from the present. Fanta knew that this feeling said more about her than it did about the passage of time. There were overlaps, gaps, echoes, places to start where they had left off. She didn't need to see history to know that it flowed through everything. All contemporary narratives of decline and crisis miss one thing. The aim was never to win against a singular enemy or system. It was to name current conditions for what they were: undignified, deadly, alienating. The institution, law, policy, they obscured that fact, moving Fanta further and further away from principled resistance and the collective action that would temporarily alleviate conditions and later transform them permanently. Damacy smiled a smile too thick for her face. She had chosen Simon because she trusted that he would keep the material safe. Contrary to popular belief, in his heyday, Simon had been the most daring of them all. He had planned a People's Day of Action when others were too scared to be caught mobilizing. She spoke of him like a big sister who allows her little brother to think that he is protecting her, when really, she is the one shielding him from the worst of the world. Workers in the sun are ushering in a general strike. There are so many bodies littered on the street, it is hard to distinguish a hand from a foot, a face from the smudge of ruined film that Fanta holds in the present. In the past, in front of her, the many faces are ready to break their chains, ready to destroy and remake the categories that have destined them never to reap the fruits of their labor. The boss is threatening to fire and replace them all, and they know he can do this. Work is hard to come by in this moment, and inflation has ravaged the cities. Arms linked, they refuse to move. They don't understand themselves as placed in any spatio-temporal location. They are in the middle of a dispute, and that dispute is urgently connected to the question of how they will live. The dispute is all that matters. She joins them. The assembly line seemed so far away at first, but when she reaches it, she feels a strange reverb. She is trembling. The potential stored in their bodies has entered hers. It is knocking about, the sensations pushing outwards from underneath her skin. Soon after this, Fanta gets lost. The days begin to crash into one another, and she can't seem to make it back. It starts slowly at first. Whole days slip through her fingers. She misses office hours on Friday. The clock begins to lie, and sometimes when she looks to it for direction, it turns into a dripping mess. Without it, she can't even confirm that she is standing on solid ground. I'm writing this to let you know that I met the future. She was black, flustered, and full of anxiety. It is unthinkable, but in her I saw myself and my grandmother and the women who invited me to my first meeting. I think I saw the legacy of my work living and breathing and asking me questions about you, Simon. I wanted to tell her to calm down. Capital's trick is to make us believe that there is no space for maneuver. We are merely living through another stage that appears all-consuming. I am writing this because I want some record of what is happening. Things are falling apart. Our operations are increasingly unsustainable. Every meeting is a battle instead of an attempt at cooperation. You're gone, and with you the courage that stops us from being scared to face the police, or call a demonstration, or stop an addiction. There's a split between those of us wanting to continue work at the point of need, building through political education, and those who want to take on the state more directly. I can't spend days typing up meeting minutes or compiling agenda points anymore. I don't want to put stress on my little one. The women are frankly exhausted, and things are beginning to fracture, even in the commune. Police stand outside now and intimidate the young mothers who come to us for shelter. We're losing more and more of our best thinkers to the university and government advisory panels. They are hurt that some of us call them traitors. I haven't the time to write in the way I want to, not properly. Only poems here and there on scraps of paper that I never remember to keep. The strange thing about watching power break down is wondering what they will write about it. Who will remember us here, now, in the middle of things? It is Simon who finds the letter. He's been hit with a wave of nostalgia recently and wants something to remind him of being young. There's no date, but he remembers receiving it just before Damacy left Berlin. They said her mind was going, even then. He kept this one. Didn't admit it to the archive because he wanted some piece of Damacy as he knew her. She was always intent on naming what was happening, on writing it down so that it felt real. She never let him forget that a political framework without revolutionary love is just another empty structure. No one was better at making political connections than she was. No one traversed so many political genealogies with ease. He felt a pang of shame. She would have much to say about his life now. Fanta crashes into Tej from behind in the kitchen, arms so happy to be holding on to something solid. She can't say how long she's been gone for. Temporal limbo is unforgiving. She feels Tej's body relax, and the moment prolongs itself. History's past and future always linger somewhere in the here and now. Strangely, she has this overwhelming desire to speak to Simon. Thank you so much.